Hello, I'm Peter Tufano, the Dean of Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Welcome to the latest in a series of events and conversations called Leadership in Extraordinary Times. This series has two elements. The first, we hear from world-leading academics from Oxford and other parts of the world who can help us understand what's going on and how to deal with a set of health, economic, and humanitarian crises. The second part, we hear from leaders at the front, women and men who are in positions of leadership in these extraordinary times. Well, the science of the coronavirus is not defined by nations or regions. These economic, humanitarian, political, and other implications vary dramatically across the world. In the coming weeks, we'll be speaking to leaders in different regions, the Americas, China, Africa, and more, to understand what's going on in their areas. I think that we'll find that while there are clear differences, there are also similarities and themes already echoed in this series, which will resonate across countries: the need for principled leadership, the need to make evidence-based decisions, and the yet unsatisfied need to collaborate. Today, we travel to Mexico to hear from two leaders in the business world there. Introducing them today and moderating the discussion is my Oxford Saïd colleague, Professor Matthew Amengual. Matthew is a member of our international business group, is a scholar of Latin America, with particular expertise in the political economy of development and global labor standards. His work explores the politics of promoting economic development that is both equitable and sustainable. Matthew's research is rooted in comparative political economy and focuses on regulation, Latin American politics, and global labor standards. Over to you, Matthew, for a great afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm very glad to be joined today by Alvaro Rodriguez Arregui and Maria Ariza. Alvaro is a co-founder and managing partner of IGNIA, a venture capital fund in Mexico. He was chairman of the board of Banco Comportamos, the largest microfinance institution in the Americas, and importantly, is a member of the Saïd Business School's Global Leadership Council. He's been recognized internationally as a leading social entrepreneur and has more awards and is on the board of more organizations than I could recount in this brief bio. We'd just be here recounting his accomplishments. So we're thrilled that he can join us. Maria is the general director of a new institutional stock exchange in Mexico, BIVA. She is also the founder and managing partner of Facial Design, a company that develops and markets products for women. And she was the CEO of Amexcap, the Mexican Association for Private Equity and Venture Capital. Again, these are only some of her impressive achievements, and we're delighted to have her with us. As with the other Leadership in Extraordinary Times guests, I will interview Alvaro and Maria for about 35 minutes, and then we will open the floor up to you all who are out there watching and your questions. Before we get started, I'd just like to echo Peter's points and highlight some of the reasons why I think that this session is particularly important. As Peter alluded to, the responses from businesses, governments, and society to this pandemic have been starkly different throughout the world. Today, we begin the process of taking these diverse experiences seriously. As a global community at Oxford, we come from and work in countries all over the world. To operate globally, at a minimum, we need to understand what is happening around the world. And in addition, when we learn about the experiences from a variety of contexts, we can better understand what is happening in our own home countries and other places. As the current crisis deepens, it's forcing us to reevaluate our priors about what allows societies and businesses to respond effectively and equitably in the face of such large challenges. And for this reason, I'm especially glad that Alvaro and Maria have joined us today. So I'll start out broad before we get into the specifics and ask you, before the pandemic hit, what was happening in Mexico's economy? What were promising opportunities? Where were things going positively?
I'll start, if that's okay with you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Matthew, for the invitation. I'm very, very honored. Let me just take you back 3 to 5 years ago in Mexico. We were doing good, I believe. We reached innovation stages, very comparable with many important outperforming growing emerging economies. And this had grown private investment in the form of microfinancing companies, financial lessors, and also venture and private equity managers that were supporting this entrepreneurial ecosystem. We saw spaces for new ideas, disruption, innovation, and access to capital. In fact, it had been amazing to see the whole ecosystem strengthening across Latin America. Startups and entrepreneurship ecosystem was really, really flowing. In fact, Global Entrepreneurship Monitor considered LATAM as one of the most important regions of early entrepreneurship worldwide. I'm talking innovation in several industries. Well, we saw important activity within the fintech space specifically, since almost half of LATAM's population remained unbanked. So in terms of venture capital, the last 5 years were the most active in terms of transactions and amount invested. I saw it through Amexcap when I was leading the Private Equity Association, and I met Alvaro there. We experienced and saw this rate, 22% annual growth rate for 10 years. We got to the point of having 8 funds of private equity to more than 150 active funds in Mexico, managing more than 58 billion under assets under management. We transacted more than 2,000 companies, and those are, becoming important, growing companies, institutionalized, and I think we actually managed to, to mature and transform this traditional way of doing business in Mexico, as as family-owned business. We're very, traditional and not, reaching for institutional investment in many cases. So we started to see Mexican startups being funded from international investors as well. And all of a sudden, big names as, SoftBanks and many others came in. So in the past 3 years, we saw at least 50 startups that had received rounds above 5 million, with some that had even received more than 100 million tickets. So in this sense, the early and expansion stage funds were boosting. But we were not seeing many exits, no liquidity for investors. Some of them, specifically the Afores, which are the pension funds in Mexico, who were participating from the beginning, right around 2005, 2008, that were supposed to, be seeing exits soon, they didn't see liquidity. Only 4% of exits were tapping the markets compared to other economies, where private equity drove these amazing companies forward and investors took liquidity back. So the reality is that few funds in Mexico were actually considering the market as their exit strategy. So what was happening? Actually, we compare the size of capital markets, we are very, very behind its potential. The world market capitalization is equivalent to 73 trillion US dollars, and of this amount, 0.51 is represented by Mexico. The market is considered small, not profound, not liquid, stagnant, with the same companies, no investors, no dynamism, very boring. In other countries, capital markets have active funding participation, even for medium and fast-growing companies. In Mexico, our market is only responsible for 9% of the total national financing to private sector. So this is why was the objective of BIVA behind it. In order to offer an efficient and accessible funding option for medium-sized growing companies, preferably those backed by private equity. Hundreds of businesses need across capital to support and manage risk in the years ahead. Innovative startups and major technology partners, even a hub for LATAM as well, that could attract more activity into the region. We saw all of this. We add up, all medium-sized companies or mature startups reaching higher series, our graduated VC companies. So we had a great potential of market out there that was not being served by markets at all. BIVA has been an important actor. We have been in place since August 2018. We started operations. We triggered important improvements in both primary and secondary markets. We use NASDAQ technology, and that has been able for us to attract new institutional investors to dynamize our trading. As of today, only 1.5 years after operation started, we have reached an average of 20% of monthly market share, with days of more than 37%. So we've made overall innovation regarding indexes, more inclusive. We've reached more than 37 new securities that have been listed in BIVA, and we have been financing more than $20 billion so far. So we were, confident that we were doing our job. We were creating an option, a different option to access liquidity for investors within the private equity industry that we saw was not looking into the public market as an exit strategy. So that was okay, but after a year and a half of our new government, it has been really quite a challenge. Complete change of political and economic policy, an economy that had already stagnated and sank into the mild recession in the first semester of 2019. Accompanied by decisions taken against long-term investments, such as a new airport, for example, and among others that have been self-inflicted wounds. So even before the pandemic, we saw a decrease in possessive flows of non-residents in equities in Mexico. We saw a great contraction occurring in November of more than $1 billion outflows. So we believe we are, reaching this moment of conjunction of what happened in 2019 with the new pandemic that we'll talk about it later.
So let me just complement what Maria was saying. Some things which were really exciting before the pandemic, Matthew, was Mexico. A friend of mine says that when the world ends, he wants to be in Mexico because everything arrives late in Mexico. And the digital revolution is no exception to this. It arrived late, but it really arrived with a force, a little bit as Maria was saying. In Mexico today, we have 100% of the working adults connected to the internet. We're the market with the highest growth of e-commerce in the world, above India, above China. Latin America, actually, as a region, is the highest growth e-commerce market in the world. And some large companies like Facebook or Netflix or Spotify or Amazon have seen Mexico as a very important market. For example, for Netflix, Mexico is the second largest market in the world. For Spotify, Mexico City, it's its largest market in the world, on top of, for example, New York. For Facebook, Mexico is number 5. And Amazon started until 2015 talking about coming late, but it's the market where it's reached $1 billion in sales the fastest. And so we were seeing a tremendous digital revolution, and that's something that was going on really well in Mexico before the crisis.
Great. So there's an interesting view of things exploding and going really, really well, and then sort of a crisis hitting before this current crisis. So why don't we move up to the current day and start with the focus on capital markets. So as this crisis hit, what's been happening in capital markets around high growth firms, around foreign direct investment? What impact has that had in these last months?
Sure. Let me just go back to 2019. I think we ended this year with all-time highs in international capital markets, with the longest bull market period in history. some of the main world indexes, such as the S&P 500, the CAC 40 de Paris, from Paris, the DAX index from Germany, closed in an average of 30% growth. Even one in Latin America, Brazil, was participating around this range of returns. Mexican market closed, though, with a modest 4% due to national factors, uncertainty, and low economic growth expectations. So we started 2020, and despite this trade agreement that was reached early January between US and China, the US and global markets began to speculate and show some volatility given the expansion of coronavirus. Closure of factories, shops, and contraction of the productive supply of this country, which has historically been the supplier and creator of global wealth. So as a result of rapidly developing global pandemic, key global stock exchanges suffered the worst intraday fall since 2008, limiting a positive start to the quarter in terms of IPO and further offer activity. The S&P 500 decreased more than 25%, leading to a new bear market state. While in case of Europe and Germany, London, Spain, France, all had contractions of over 30% during this year. In the same month, market volatility reached its highest level since the global financial crisis as well. Mexican case was no exception. Expectations for job creation in Mexico for the rest of the years are negative, and local consumption will fall approximately 5.5%. This affects the results of our capital market, and we compare our proper index, which is called FTSE BIVA. In April, just to April 2019, we're looking at a 15% decrease against last year. Annual growth expectations for Mexico are being revised downwards as well. According to various banks and financial entities, we see expectations ranging from -3 to -9. So we've seen a contraction from investors towards our country, notably skeptical about Mexican situation and economic expectations for the rest of the year. We're not only facing COVID, but also we have diverse factors summing to this crisis. With the oil prices as well, had direct effect on Pemex, and that resulted in a downgrade of the company and on the sovereign. So this situation also compromises the viability of the oil productivity in Mexico, and that has gotten also the fact of government oil revenues gone down. We have a currency devaluating to historic numbers. Recently reached peso-dollar ratios that have surpassed the 25 pesos per dollar range. So this context has been accompanied by not well-perceived government decisions, such as cancellations from foreign investments, such as Cervecera Constellation Brands, and finally the persistence of federal governments to carry out with large investment opportunities that not yet have demonstrated feasibility. So the outlook for the remainder of 2020 is highly uncertain, and until the markets become more comfortable with a consensus on the effects of the lockdown measures on the economy and how recovery will look after these measures, we can expect further volatility and fund managers rebalance portfolio. And this, of course, will impact our markets as well. And we are also not seeing any movements, any deployment or any pipeline in productive or developing projects. So we don't have any SECADES or SERPIs or REITs or any projects in the short term.
Well, Matthew, let me put a more positive note, because clearly the macro situation here is very, very concerning. But as I was saying, we were coming from a big boom in the digital space, in the digital economy in Mexico, and partly because still things were very underpenetrated. The penetration of e-commerce, for example, in Mexico was half that of Brazil, and Brazil was about half of the United States. So in general, it was very underpenetrated. And this pandemic has become an accelerator to the digital economy. And we're seeing it already, and let me give you some examples. You know, a company called Tienda Nube that operates in Brazil and in Argentina has since the crisis between 100 to 250% growth. This company helps SMEs to start selling in e-commerce. Or a company called Kinedu, which does early childhood education, and has increased about 120% since the crisis. Or a company called Arcus that does bill collections. You can now pay your utility bill online instead of what people used to do, going to the bank, etc. It has grown 135% since the start of the crisis. So these are some examples of companies that are doing really well. And in general, we are seeing tremendous growth in the whole space of the digital economy. So this is a huge opportunity for new entrepreneurs and a huge opportunity for new talent, that a world that is moving from analog to digital.
Great, that's fascinating. It's interesting to see where the baseline was in terms of penetration, creating sort of new opportunities for really, really rapid growth. As I'm thinking about the services that you're talking about, I'm imagining sort of the users of those services and some of the smaller firms that they might be competing with, the small little stores on the corner and the micro enterprises. So it's sort of thinking about it from the workforce level, and sort of the great majority of PMEs, of sort of small, medium-sized enterprises, and the workers who are both in the formal and informal economy. What's been going on there, and how have those sectors been holding up?
We cannot hear you.
Alvaro, we can't hear you for some reason. We still can't hear you, Alvaro. Hopefully one of the tech people will get you sorted quickly. Maria, do you have any thoughts while we wait for Alvaro to get sorted out? I hate to put you on the spot.
Yeah, don't worry. Alvaro, you sure?
Yeah.
No, we can hear you now. Nope, you were back muted.
Something happened that you couldn't hear me.
Okay, now.
Okay. I don't know what happened. So anyway, if you can put slide number 8, and we'll go from there to support me to answer this question. So in Mexico, we had, before the crisis, we had very, very low historical lows in terms of go to number 8, please. And we had historical lows in unemployment. So we confronted the crisis from a point of strength from that point of view. However, obviously things have changed significantly. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to present here what's going on in terms of micro entrepreneurs in Mexico and also people that are employed. So since the crisis, when you ask them what's your biggest concern, number one, they answered their debts. And number two is their job. And number three is their health. It's interesting how low health is, which tells you a little bit that the message hasn't really penetrated and on how deadly this virus is. The different colors is in the past 4 weeks. So this situation has stayed pretty much stable in the past 4 weeks. It hasn't gotten worse in the past 4 weeks. In the next slide, as you can see here, and you can click one more time, please. One important part is, okay, people don't have a job, but they usually either receive government subsidies or help for family members. In the case of Mexico, it's very important, for example, money transfers from their family members that are working in the US. So 60% were receiving some sort of subsidy or family support. So what has happened with this support since then? If you click one more, it's about half of them have lost one of those supports. So this is obviously something which is quite dire, especially for people in the base of a pyramid. If you go to next slide. Now, if you're a micro entrepreneur, if you ask them what would you say, is that 11% say everything is the same, but 4 weeks ago was 30%. So this situation has become quite worse in 4 weeks, even though in the past couple of weeks has stayed quite stable. Now, 50% have closed their business. Imagine you're an entrepreneur, micro entrepreneur that's selling in a fruit stand in the street, and you're living on a daily basis, and either you're not selling or you have to close your business. And 36% of them have decreased their sales. Now, if you're an employee, 16% says everything is the same, but 4 weeks ago it was 35%. And about 17% has been fired. That has stayed quite stable in the past 4 weeks. 37% have experienced a salary reduction. And again, it has gotten worse in the last 4 weeks. And 18 to 20% have been paid, but have not been paid, but are still working. So the situation is quite dire in the base of the pyramid. Go to the next slide. Now, if you ask them, what's your income today versus before COVID-19, on average is 30% income versus before COVID-19. This has stayed quite stable in the past 4 weeks, but the big question is, how long will people be going to be able to last with 1/3 of their income? And this is the part that is most worrisome in Mexico right now. The majority of the population are earning 1/3 of what they were earning before. How long can they last?
Wow, that's sobering to think about. So in sort of thinking about the size of this problem, can you describe what the government has been doing so far to confront it? What are sort of the main steps that have been taken? There's been a lot of comparisons between Mexico and other parts of Latin America in particular. Other governments on the left, like in Argentina, have sort of seem to have taken a different route. So what's been happening in Mexico to confront this?
Yeah, well, as Alvaro was saying, basically 99.8% of companies are SMEs in Mexico, and that reduces to more than 5 million companies, of which 50% are informal. So government announced as part of its economic recovery, only 2 million loans for these companies, for this 5 million. One of those million will come from the Mexican Social Security Institute, around credits around $1,200, which, considering the cost of wages, I think will be very low to be enough to cover those needs. Plus, government said that this sort of loans will only be given to SMEs that can demonstrate to have not reduced their workforce during the previous months. So that makes it even harder for companies to get the loan, and basically less than 1 million companies will be able to get it. The other million will be given by the Ministry of Economy, and those are also $1,200 credits. But for self-employment mostly, informal sector, including taxi drivers, waiters, markets on roads, and servants of the region, as the government says. So total package from the government was less than 0.5% of GDP. No packages for larger companies and no space for tax payment extensions, as seen in other economies. So as you said, other countries such as Colombia and Chile, which are in Latam, have packages between 5 and 8% GDP. In addition, the current federal government has decided not to incur more debt, not to make use of its credit lines by International Monetary Fund, and not to postpone high investment projects in the short term, such as the Maya train and the refinery of Bocas. So what we see in it, many of these businesses have been closing, resulting in unemployment and economic applications. Just in April 2020, just a week ago, the government announced that 500,000 jobs were lost. This figure is especially alarming when considering that this is only accounting for formal jobs. So the negative impacts for most disadvantaged will be felt for years to come within education, healthcare, and access to jobs. So basically, that's the part of the government, and Alvaro will tap on monetary recovery as well.
Sure. So obviously, we have the central bank that can also do. They announced a liquidity line for banks of approximately $30 billion. One part of it, 1/3 of that, was to fund SMEs, which is when the announcement was made, that was a very good news. However, now that we're starting to understand how that will work, it's going to be extremely difficult to implement. So, as a comparison to the PPP in the US, the support that was given to SMEs, which was very simple to operate, this one is tremendously difficult to operate. So we are not very hopeful on those funds making it to the SMEs. And then there was also a big announcement from the part of the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, together with a group, an organization of business people in Mexico, to also provide financing to SMEs. They announced about 12.5 billion. But this turns out that it's only good for those SMEs that are B2B, that sell to businesses. And that's a minority of the SMEs. The majority of the SMEs are B2C. They sell directly to consumers. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of help. In Mexico, the announcements that have been made, it's only 0.1% of GDP for help. When you compare to countries like Peru, which is in the high single digits, and the US, obviously, what the US is doing, just to put things in perspective, the incentive package from the US is 2 times the Mexican economy, which also brings an opportunity for us as an export country to the US. But we can talk about that later.
Great. And you've been talking about the macro government response. Have there been pockets of excellence at the state level? Have certain states managed to get out in front of this a little bit more?
So there has. If you can put slide 13, I can show you a little bit of how states are faring differently in terms of the pandemic. So if you go to the next slide, so here, this is a heat map of where the different states are. And it's divided in 3 groups. Group 1 are the states that are doing the worst. And group 3 are the states that are doing the best. The different columns are you can see number of deaths, hospitalizations, etc. So the good news here, as I was saying earlier, is that some of the states are very much an export engine for Mexico. For example, Nuevo León, which is at the very bottom in Group 3, is doing very well. Nuevo León has a lot of manufacturing facilities that export to the U.S. So there are some states that are doing extremely well in facing the pandemic, and they're well positioned to capture that opportunity in the U.S. when the U.S. starts the economy again. And from a geopolitical perspective, the fact that the U.S. now wants to diversify more from China, these states will be able to capture a lot of that demand from the U.S. So at the regional level, there are good news.
That's good. That's great to hear. And I've read somewhat about pressure from the U.S. to get factories opened along the border, and this sort of synchronizing the pandemics across the two countries seems to be complicated. What are your thoughts on how that might influence the sort of thinking about the exit? Although we're all really speculating and thinking about the exit throughout the world, it would be interesting to hear to sort of build on that element of geography and proximity to markets and thinking about potential exit pathways.
Well, and a Mexican president about a bit more than 100 years ago said, "So close from the U.S., so far from God." So we have the benefit of being very close to the U.S. and that puts us in a position of strength. Literally, as we speak, the cabinet of the Mexican government is having meetings to see which sectors they are going to allow to open up and at what speed, and very importantly, as the graph showed, in what regions, because you have to think regionally here. Those states that are doing well, let them open up sooner and be able to connect with the supply chain of the US. One obvious one is the auto sector. We have a huge auto parts sector that supplies to the US OEMs or car manufacturers. It's been said that will open up in the US on May 18th. For them to open up, their supply chain needs to open up. And there are huge companies in Mexico that supply to those car manufacturers, and obviously that needs to be connected. So hopefully that can be implemented. Supposedly this Friday it will be announced how those companies will be able to open up.
Right, great. We'll see. So we've got a number of questions that have been coming in from all over the world to you all. So I'm going to start with one that came in from the UK and going back to the discussion about what's happening in capital markets. And the question is that despite the volatility, what are the elements that make the Mexican market attractive? So exchange rates, skilled workforce, and what's your sense of really what makes Mexico an attractive investment destination?
Yeah.
Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I think Mexico has a great opportunity, as Alvaro said, since we are proximate to the U.S. and we have this agreement called Connect, and we have great potential to put it together and start, as soon as U.S. opens up, Mexico can start opening operations in that sense. And I think that makes us a very competitive area. But also, I think we like all the talent in Mexico, all the technology we've seen, all the opportunities within the financial sector to deepen our financial markets, not only within the banking sector, but also making the markets, the other non-banking segments of more reliable, more open to innovative new startups. I think that's a very interesting area that Mexico has there for the future. And I think, I mean, what we have seen, it's important funds from abroad and important investors looking at these opportunities. And I believe whenever this pandemic go down, Mexico will be in shape if we work from now in terms of allocating capital to these new technologies, digital, as Alvaro said, fintechs, non-banking institutions that also permit the capital to SMEs, and in those areas will be important to develop and the economy in Mexico and accompany the process of Mexico being next to the U.S. and opening new ways of trading with the U.S. I don't know if you agree with that.
Just to complement, I mean, a couple of things. One is Mexico has great talent. We graduate 120,000 engineers per year. One interesting anecdote is, for example, when Lego, the toy company, came to Mexico and set up a manufacturing facility, they were the first ones to be surprised that out of 1,500 people that they had to hire, there were only 2 expats, because they found tremendously good talent in Mexico. Specifically in areas, Maria mentioned fintech. There's a huge opportunity in fintech, partly because the low penetration of financial services, but also because the incumbents have a lot to be desired on the quality of their services. In specific, for example, credit to SMEs, there's a huge opportunity. I talked about exports, all about logistics. It's a huge opportunity, and also industrial facilities and everything about e-commerce. This pandemic will create a huge change in behavior, and a lot of people were still reluctant to buy through e-commerce, and now they're having to do it. They're being forced to do it, and they're figuring out that it actually works. That you pay and it's okay, and the package arrives, and that's going to change behaviors, and the boom that we're going to have in Mexico is going to be huge. Just to give you some numbers, by 2023 we expected to have about 11% penetration of e-commerce. Now by 2023 we expect to have about 15 to 16% penetration of e-commerce, which is where the US is today. So just around the corner we'll have the penetration, and as the disruption that is going on. You're in the UK. The UK right now is at around 18%. So we're going to be close to a country like the UK in just a few years, and that's a huge opportunity.
Wow. So one of the questions you just answered was is thinking about the opportunity to start digital services in locations as Mexico is. And I'm understanding you're saying that there's just going to be an explosion of growth that makes it a real advantage. Another question that came in actually from Mexico, from Viola Garcia, is about the rate of recovery of the SMEs. So how fast do you think, and this was for Alvaro, that the SMEs are going to recover from the crisis triggered by COVID-19?
So usually when we talk about SMEs, we're also talking about micro enterprises. So Maria was giving us some numbers about that we have 5 million companies in Mexico, including micro enterprises. So let me just give you some numbers. So there are SMEs, which are companies between 10 employees to 100 employees. There are about 115,000 in Mexico. Companies below 10 employees, there are close to 5 million in Mexico. Okay, so let's separate between the micro enterprises and SMEs, because these are 2 different problems. Micro entrepreneurs are very nimble. So the lady that had a fruit stand today is selling antibacterial gel, or she's selling face masks. So she switches her inventory and her business very quickly. The numbers that I showed, tells that it's very worrisome of, they're also very resilient, but how resilient can you be, right? So, they will recover. They will recover relatively fast because they tend to focus on basic needs. The SMEs, again, companies from 10 employees to 100 employees, those will take much longer. Those are much more connected to the macroeconomy. And when you put on top of that the fact that there's no access to financing, just to give you some sense of dimension, credit to SMEs in Mexico is 2% of GDP. For example, Brazil is 7% of GDP, Peru is 8% of GDP, Chile is 11% of GDP. So penetration of loans to SMEs in Mexico is tremendously low. And without access to financing, it's going to be very, very hard for them to recover anytime soon.
Okay, wow. And thinking about that and the employment effects of that, one question that came was whether or not the government will or should implement universal basic income if the crisis continues past September and we see a second wave that comes back through in the autumn.
I mean, one of the issues that we have with this government, this is a very interesting government to analyze because it's a leftist populist government, but you've never seen in the world a populist government that does not want to increase its levels of debt. So for any of these initiatives, right or wrong, you need to increase your level of debt. You have to get the money from somewhere, and also because it's going to take a long time for SMEs to pick up. Taxes will probably go down, so they need to indebt themselves. So it seems like they were not willing to do that, opposite to what most people are doing or most countries are doing in the US, in the world. Most countries are doing counter-cyclical initiatives. And there are reasons in their philosophy of why they're not willing to do that, and we could get into that. But the fact is, they're not willing to indebt themselves, so they don't have the funds to do something like that.
Okay. Maria?
And Alvaro, I think, basically the packages that we're seeing are for the micro companies, the small and micro companies, and the informal 1 million informal employees. We're not really seeing something for medium and for medium-sized companies that have invested, that have a manufacturing plant, or that have a store, and that need capital to go on, no? And that's exactly I think what we're trying to say here. I mean, Mexico has a financing system that has only been looking at the traditional banking, and also the government has only seen the banking as a way of getting that recovery package out. So I think we are missing this other part. How do we tap into the SMEs that are being capitalized by non-banking institutions? So what we believe is those can be tapped through the market. Those are accredited. For those that are already accredited in the market, government can push some capital into those non-banking institutions that are listed, and that capital can flow into the SMEs that are accredited. So I think we have this other part that we are not tapping there, we're not using, and that we are forgetting, and that's a lot of companies out there in Mexico that need the liquidity, that need the capital to pass this crisis now. And also, and for the future, I mean, to get in line with the growth that we need in Mexico, we need other institutional investors, other retail investors participating in the financial markets. We have a very concentrated institutional investors in Mexico. There are few of them are really participating in the venture capital industry, for example. We need, and no development banks are actually active right now. So we need to push those investors, those institutional investors, again, to get the flowing of SMEs right from the earliest stages, and that flow will continue through the access of listed vehicles or not listed, but that the capital will flow for larger companies. I think it's important for them, and I think that's something that we have been telling the government, not only to look at packages in non-banking traditional, that as I was saying, but also push all the institutional investors through these structured vehicles that can get access to capital for those entrepreneurial ecosystem and SMEs.
All right, great. Thank you. So one other question that came in is more general, stepping back as we get to the end of our hour together. And it's a question from Samuel saying, what kind of leaderships do you think the world is looking out for during these difficult times? And thinking about what kind of skills and traits of leaders.
Well, I think this this is a really interesting discussion in terms of where this pandemic, this world crisis, that we're facing it, I think, with very weak leadership. And when you think about when was the last time that the world faced such a large crisis, it happened probably in the World War II. And in that case, we faced that crisis with very strong leaders. We now look back to the Churchills and the Roosevelts as examples of great leadership. And I think the leadership that we now have, it leaves a lot to be desired. So we definitely are handicapped in facing this crisis. When you do a correlation of the countries that are doing the worst in the crisis and the type of leadership that they have, there's a strong correlation between populists and not doing well in terms of on the pandemic, right? So to answer the question, we definitely do not need populists, because the numbers show that they're not doing well in facing the pandemic. And the biggest
populists. Some populists are doing better. Argentina stands out, I must say, as someone who often thinks a lot about Argentina's difficulties as a populist government that's taken a very different turn.
There's definitely always the exception to the rule.
Yes.
And now, once the pandemic is over, we have the economic crisis, and that's going to be a long winter. So I think people that have a much better understanding of the economy and how to fare that better will be a very strong capability for leaders.
Great. Maria, do you want to weigh in?
I was maybe thinking on, committed leaders, risky leaders that take risks, leaders that work in different ways, that are flexible, that are resilient, that can engage their talent into new forms of every day, into new ideas every day, that can listen to others' decisions or positions, and take those recommendations in. I think that's exactly what we need. We need to be able to move and navigate different different ways and be able to be flexible and resilient in the way.
Now, let me say one more thing on that question, bring it home to Mexico. And I think once after the economic crisis, we're going to face a social crisis. We have a huge difference. Our last big economic crisis was in 1995. So it's already been 25 years. But in that case, we had two big benefits. One was the bailout from the US, and the second was immigration. About 3 million people emigrated to the US, that was a huge pressure valve for us. This time around, we're not going to get salvaged by the US. They have their own problems. And two, forget about emigrating to the US. There are no jobs there, so why emigrate, right? And so there are no pressure valves this time. And without a pressure valve, the social crisis will most likely be dire. And so locally, you will need credible leaders that are able to work with society so that the social crisis doesn't get out of hand.
So to end on an optimistic note, we have just a few minutes. What are your hopes for the world that will emerge from this other side? So we've talked about, so we have this crisis, but things are shifting. What are your hopes for where we might be better off?
Well, I'm actually quite hopeful on two fronts. One is we were talking about a change in behavior. For the first time, we've been talking about not having profit as the only objective. Saïd is a leader in the world in social enterprise, and it's had for many years a focus on how to create a better society. So for the first time, we did not put profits or the economy as a priority. We put health as the priority. And I think that's a huge shift in the paradigm. And I think that paradigm will remain. And that world that many of us were imagining for many years, and especially, Oxford and Saïd, the new generations that really understand how profits cannot be the only priority. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be a priority, that it should not be the only priority. I think that world that new generation is imagining, it's going to happen. And the new generation, it's much better prepared to cope with that type of new rules. So I think it's a huge opportunity, not only in the fact that those rules would change, but that for the new generations. And the second part that I'm very optimistic about is the world will become much more digital. And by the world becoming much more digital, there is a lot to be said that the world will be much flatter. Tom Friedman wrote the book "The World is Flat" already, about 15 years ago. With this, now the world will become much more flatter. Now we're used to working remotely, and now you'll be able to much easier hire the computer scientists from Thailand, and that before you thought that probably you need to bring that person locally, etc., etc. So I think it's going to be much more democratic.
Maria, I'll give you the last word.
No, I mean, I'm optimistic as well. I mean, I know this is a great challenge and we're living very tough times, but we have lived them in the past and we have recovered, and markets recover after all. I don't know if it's going to take 1 month or 1 year or 10 years, but we'll be back, and opportunities will be there for those who are ready to take them. So investors all around will look and will keep looking for those opportunities, for those managers, for those entrepreneurs, for those great ideas, for those that took this time and used it strategically to become more, more with more R&D or with more lean teams. I don't know. Use this time for companies. Use it to be, I don't know, more strong for the next slide. And I think opportunities will be there. Investors will be there. Capital will be there for them. And I think we're there for helping those companies reach the next step, then reach the next level. We want to accompany those entrepreneurs. We want to accompany those VC funds, private equity funds, so those companies that want to take the next level, that want to take and tap in the markets and make available this opportunity for many other people through the markets. So I'm positive. I think we are in a good moment to rethink, to reshape, and to be ready for next slide.
And if I might add, all societies have flourished after pandemics and wars, and great innovations have emerged after times of crisis.
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on, and it's actually a segue to the next session that we're going to have in our Leading in Extraordinary Times series on Thursday, that will focus on entrepreneurship and asking how entrepreneurs can not just recover from the crisis, but actually help rejuvenate the economy. So I'd like to just wrap up by thanking you very much for joining us today. It's been wonderful to hear your insights, to learn what's going on, and for all of us at Saïd Business School, thank you. Just my deepest thanks.
No, thank you.